The heavy wooden doors of the American command post swung open. A high-ranking German SS general walked into the room. His black uniform was immaculate. His leather boots were polished to a mirror shine. The Iron Cross hung proudly around his neck. Even though his country was completely defeated, his capital city was in ruins, and his army had been crushed, he walked with his chest puffed out and his chin held high. He walked as if he was still the absolute master of Europe, stepping directly in front of the wooden desk where an American commander sat processing prisoners of war. The SS general brought his boots together with a sharp, loud click. He raised his right hand in a crisp, stiff military salute. He stood at strict attention, waiting for the American officer to return the salute. He waited for the respect that was traditionally given to a captured senior officer. He waited and he waited, but the American officer didn't look up from his paperwork. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't say a single word. The room was dead silent. Slowly, the American officer put down his pen. He stood up from his chair. He looked directly at the gleaming medals on the German's chest, and then, without uttering a single syllable, the American officer simply turned his back and walked to the window, looking outside. The SS general stood frozen. His arm was still raised in the empty air. His face turned bright red. The absolute, deafening silence in the room was heavier than any physical blow. The illusion of his superiority was instantly shattered. This wasn't an isolated incident, this was an official, deliberate, and devastating psychological weapon. It was a direct order from the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, fully supported by General George S. Patton. An order that explicitly banned American soldiers from returning the salutes of SS officers. An order to deny them basic military courtesy. An order to simply turn their backs. But to understand why Eisenhower, a man famous for his calm diplomacy, issued one of the most disrespectful orders in military history, we have to look at the exact moment his soul turned to ice. For generations, European generals believed war was a game played by gentlemen. When a defeated officer surrendered, the victor saluted him. They shook hands. They shared a drink. Even in the burning deserts of North Africa earlier in the war, British and American commanders held a begrudging respect for German General Erwin Rommel. They treated captured officers like honorable men who had simply lost a chess match. By the spring of 1945, the high command of the Nazi military expected this tradition to continue. They expected to sit across from men like Eisenhower and Patton, drink fine whiskey, and discuss battlefield tactics. They expected respect. What they received instead was pure, devastating silence. Because the war in Europe was not a gentleman's war, and the men wearing the black uniforms of the SS were not soldiers. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was not a hot-headed man. Unlike General George S. Patton, who famously yelled, cursed, and carried pearl-handled revolvers, Eisenhower was a quiet, calculating strategist. He was a diplomat. He believed in rules, order, and international law. But on April 12, 1945, Eisenhower's worldview fundamentally and violently changed. The American Third Army, under the command of General Patton, had just liberated a place called Ohrdruf. It was a subcamp of the Buchenwald concentration camp system. When Eisenhower received the reports of what was found inside, he decided he needed to see it with his own eyes. He drove to the camp, accompanied by General Patton and General Omar Bradley. What they found inside the barbed wire was a level of pure, concentrated evil that defied human comprehension. The camp was littered with the starved, skeletal remains of thousands of innocent people. Piles of unburied corpses lay rotting in the spring sun. The survivors who approached the American generals were little more than living ghosts, their eyes hollow, their bodies ravaged by disease and unimaginable torture. The smell of death was so overpowering, so physically sickening, that the battle-hardened General Patton walked behind a building and violently vomited. But Eisenhower did not look away. His face turned as pale as a ghost, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might shatter. He forced himself to walk through every single corner of that hellhole. He walked through the execution sheds. He looked at the instruments of torture. He stared directly into the faces of the dead. He wanted every ounce of that horror burned into his memory forever. He turned to the American GIS standing nearby and gave a direct order. He told them to bring their cameras. He ordered them to take photographs of every single body, every single ditch, and every single survivor. "Get it all on record," Eisenhower said, his voice trembling with a cold, controlled fury. "Get the films. Get the witnesses. Because somewhere down the road of history, some bastard will get up and say that this never happened." Eisenhower was known as a diplomat, a man who followed the rules. But what he did next shocked even his own officers and forever changed how the American military treated its prisoners. In that exact moment, standing in the ashes of Ohrdruf, Eisenhower's diplomacy died. His respect for the German military hierarchy completely evaporated. He realized that the men he was fighting were not opposing soldiers. They were not honorable adversaries. They were monsters. And the men who led them, the generals, the SS commanders, and the Nazi elite, were the architects of a slaughter factory. In the days following the discovery of the camps, the Third Reich finally collapsed. Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. The German military officially surrendered in May 1945. Thousands of high-ranking Nazi officials, SS commanders, and Wehrmacht generals began flowing into American prisoner of war camps, but they did not walk in with their heads bowed in shame. Decades of intense psychological brainwashing had convinced these men that they were the master race. They were completely disconnected from reality. Even as their nation burned to the ground and the atrocities of the Holocaust were broadcast to the world, they remained staggeringly arrogant. They arrived at American checkpoints in luxurious Mercedes-Benz staff cars. They brought multiple suitcases filled with tailored uniforms, expensive wines, and stolen artwork. They brought their junior officers to act as their personal butlers. When they stepped out of their vehicles, they demanded to see the commanding American officer. They expected the American infantryman to stand at attention. They expected to be escorted to comfortable private quarters. They expected to sign a few documents, shake hands, and be treated like royalty in exile. One prominent example was General Oberst Hermann Bernhard Römke. After surrendering, he arrogantly demanded to be taken directly to the highest American general so he could formally and honorably hand over his pistol. He expected a ceremony. He expected cameras to capture his dignified surrender. But news of the concentration camps had spread through the American ranks like wildfire. From the highest generals down to the lowest private, every American soldier had seen the photographs. Many of them had walked through the camps themselves. The American military had absolutely zero tolerance left for Nazi arrogance. When word reached General Eisenhower that captured SS commanders and high-ranking Nazi officials were demanding military courtesies, he issued a directive that would completely shatter the egos of the German elite. Eisenhower officially suspended the traditional rules of military honor when dealing with the SS and the Nazi high command. General Patton, disgusted by what he had seen at the camps, entirely agreed. The order was brilliantly simple, yet psychologically devastating. There would be no handshakes. There would be no returning of salutes. There would be no fraternization. There would be no friendly conversations. If a captured SS general walked into an American camp and raised his hand to salute, the American soldiers were ordered to ignore it completely. They were to look right through the German officer, as if he did not exist. If the German demanded to speak to a commander, the Americans were to simply turn their backs. To a civilian, ignoring a salute might sound like a minor insult, but to a lifelong Nazi military officer, whose entire identity, pride, and ego were tied to his rank and uniform, it was a death blow to his soul. It was a total rejection of their humanity. When these arrogant Nazi generals marched into American command posts, waiting for a salute, they were met with dead silence. The American GIs, dirty, tired, and traumatized by what they'd seen in the camps, simply stared at them with eyes full of pure, unfiltered hatred. Then, the Americans would turn around and walk away. The psychological impact on the German generals was profound. You could see the confusion and then the blinding panic wash over their faces. For 12 years, these men had been treated like gods. Wherever they walked, people snapped to attention. People feared them. People obeyed them. Their uniform was a shield of absolute power. But in front of the American soldiers, that uniform meant absolutely nothing. It was just a piece of dirty cloth. When the Nazi generals demanded special food, the Americans threw standard prison rations at their feet. When they demanded private quarters, they were shoved into crowded, muddy pens with regular infantrymen. When they demanded to keep their personal servants, the Americans laughed in their faces and handed them a shovel. The Americans didn't need to beat them. They didn't need to physically torture them. By simply turning their backs, the Americans stripped these mass murderers of the one thing they valued more than their own lives, their pride. This cold, unyielding wall of disrespect went all the way to the top. Eisenhower himself led by example. Throughout the rest of the war, he famously refused to ever meet with a captured German commander. When the Axis forces surrendered in North Africa in 1943, the top German commander, General von Arnim, was captured. Von Arnim fully expected to be brought to Eisenhower's tent for a formal gentlemanly meeting. He expected a handshake and a drink. Eisenhower flatly refused to see him. He told his aides to process the German general like any other prisoner and lock him up. Von Arnim was furious, completely insulted that the Supreme Commander wouldn't even look at him. But the most famous display of this cold justice happened during the final, unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany in May 1945 at Reims, France. The German delegation was led by Generaloberst Alfred Jodl and Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg. They arrived to sign the documents that would end the bloodiest war in human history. They expected Eisenhower to be sitting at the table with them. They expected a formal, historic exchange between opposing military leaders. But Eisenhower refused to be in the same room as them. He stayed in his private office while his subordinate officers handled the actual signing of the surrender documents. Eisenhower absolutely refused to share a table, a photograph, or a handshake with the men who had orchestrated the destruction of Europe and the genocide of millions. Only after the documents were officially signed and the German military had unconditionally surrendered were Jodl and Friedeberg brought into Eisenhower's office. The room was freezing cold. Eisenhower stood behind his desk. He didn't smile. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't offer them a seat. He stared at the two defeated German commanders with eyes that could cut through steel. Eisenhower asked them one simple, blunt question. Did they understand the terms of the surrender, and were they prepared to carry them out? The German generals, stripped of all their power and dignity, quietly answered, yes. Eisenhower didn't say another word. He just nodded to the door, signaling for the guards to take them away. The meeting lasted less than a minute. There was no honor. There was no mutual respect. There was just the cold, hard reality that the master race had been utterly and completely crushed. General Dwight D. Eisenhower understood something fundamentally important about human psychology. He knew that the men who ran the Nazi Empire were narcissists. They thrived on fear, respect, and authority. If the Americans had treated them like honorable prisoners of war, it would have validated their delusion. It would have told them that, despite the concentration camps, despite the mass murder, they were still respected military men. Eisenhower refused to give them that validation. By ordering his men to turn their backs, by refusing to return their salutes, and by treating them like invisible garbage, the American military completely dismantled the Nazi ego. They forced the SS commanders to look in the mirror and realize that they weren't supermen. They weren't elite warriors. They were just pathetic, defeated criminals who were about to answer to the hangman. War is often remembered for its massive battles, the roar of artillery, and the clash of tanks. But sometimes the most powerful weapon on the battlefield makes no sound at all. Sometimes the ultimate form of justice is simply looking an evil man in the eye and turning your back. What do you think of Eisenhower's strict orders?